Hello, and welcome to our webcast, which is brought to you by the Knowledge Translation for Employment Research Center, or the KTER Center, which is housed at the American Institutes for Research. I'm your host, Ann Outlaw. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some logistics. You can find information, including the presentation slides, a text description of these slides, on our website at kter.org. Closed captioning is available. And if you're watching this webcast on YouTube, simply press the CC button on the bottom right side of the screen. And this is an on-demand webcast. So if you have questions for our presenter, please email me at aoutlaw@air.org, and I'll convey your message. You can also ask your question in the evaluation form, which I'll provide at the end of today's webcast. Today we'll hear an update about the Translating Evidence to Support Transitions, Improving Outcomes of Youth in Transition with Psychiatric Disabilities by Use and Adoption of Best Practice Transition Planning, or the TEST project, which is funded by the National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDILRR. The TEST project is one of a handful of projects funded by NIDILRR for translating disability and rehabilitation research into practice. These are exciting projects as they practice knowledge translation strategies in tangible ways. Dr. Kate Biebel is here to give us an update about her project. She is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, the deputy director of the Systems and Psychosocial Advances Research Center, and a faculty member of the NIDILRR SAMHSA-funded Learning and Working during the Transition to Adulthood Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. She is currently the co-principal investigator on the NIDILRR-funded TEST project, which is here to infuse research evidence into the transition planning process for high school students living with serious mental health conditions to support improved employment and post-secondary education outcomes. She works closely with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health on various initiatives to improve the lives of children, young adults, and families living with serious mental health conditions. Kate, are you ready to begin?
I am. Thank you. So thanks for that introduction. As Ann said, I'm going to be giving you an update on our NIDILRR grant, which we call TEST, Translating Evidence to Support Transitions. As Ann said, it's really targeted thinking about what we know from the research evidence around what helps youth and young adults do better with post-secondary outcomes, specifically around employment and education. Our acknowledgements are that this work is part of a 5-year NIDILRR grant, which is specifically focused on knowledge translation. So that's exciting for us to actually take the information from the research that we and our colleagues produce and actually think about how can we use this knowledge in the field. Also acknowledge that I am part of the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research, which is another NIDILRR SAMHSA-funded research center that focuses on youth and young adults aged 14 to 30 with serious mental health conditions in their efforts to identify and sustain schooling and work. This is a partnership with a number of collaborations. I sit at the UMass Medical School with Marcia Ellison, Sloan Huckabee, who's a consultant of ours, and Laura Golden. We also partner with Mary Wagner at SRI. We've partnered with the Transition Alliance South Carolina, NTACT, and AIR Joanne Starks. So just a little background on this project. The reason that we have focused on youth and young adults with emotional behavioral disturbances is that we know from a variety of sources that these youth and young adults have particularly stark, poor post-secondary outcomes. We know that students with emotional behavioral disturbances, or EBD, as you'll see in these slides, that students with EBD are dropping out of high school more than any other group of students, that the effect of this shortened education is related to, not surprisingly, lower wages, poor employment, and poorer health. And that in the school side, we also know that these youth are going to school after high school much less frequently and have lower rates of employment than any other category of students with disabilities. So as such, it's a particular population of students that is A, large, and B, have particularly poor outcomes. So as part of this NIDILRR knowledge translation opportunity, the gist of the grant of opportunity was you had to find a piece of NIDILRR-funded research findings and then take those findings and somehow translate that into practice. And for our group here, that's a pretty exciting opportunity because there are not necessarily as many grant-funded opportunities to actually do the knowledge translation piece. There are a number to do the research part, but then what do you do with the research findings? So these opportunities were particularly exciting to us. So given our center's focus on youth and young adults with EBD, we looked to some data from the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, and this is part of our collaboration with Mary Wagner and SRI, where findings from their research identified a few key points that we thought were things that we could use to translate into practice. So one was finding that student leadership in transition planning, so these are students who are participating in IEPs, and their transition planning were related to increased post-high school educational attainment. So students who are doing IEPs and are actually taking an active role during those IEPs seem to have significantly higher rates of continuing their education after high school. So that's one finding. The second finding that caught our eye was this notion that youth that had a college representative attending those IEP transition planning meetings, that they too had significantly higher rates of continuing with their education after high school. And this was partnered in our minds with some other research that we had looked at where we knew that students who were engaged with other community agencies during that transition IEP process were also then more likely to be engaged in post-secondary employment. So we took that and sort of combined it to this notion of community partners. So the punchline is that having involvement of community partners during the transition planning IEP process, that leads to increased participation in post-secondary education and employment. So that's the second piece of data we were translating. The third, again, comes from the Mary Wagner research that identified that students who had an increased concentration of career and technical education coursework, so that meant 4 or more CTE, these career and technical education credits, that if you had 4 or more of those CTE credits, that you had a significantly increased likelihood of having full-time employment. So we took those 3 discrete findings from the data and proposed to develop 3 practice guides that were geared towards high school special educators, and to create practice guides that would take those research findings and translate them into actual activities and things they could do in the high school setting that would encourage the use of student-led transition teams, encourage having community partnerships and adult agency representation during IEP meetings, and then third, how to ensure that there's a concentration of CTE coursework for those students with EBD. So our work over the last couple years has been to develop these practice guides. So this is these are still drafts, but they're pretty completed drafts. And this first one is a screenshot of supporting student-led transition planning. You can see in the table of contents that it talks about, what you need to know about student-led IEPs for students with EBD. And then it really walks through a set of 5 specified lessons about what are the things that educators can do to support students in being more engaged and taking a leadership role in their IEP process. I will say that there are resources out there around how to conduct student-led IEP processes. For us, the twist and the value added was really about trying to map that onto what do we know are the specific challenges, concerns, strengths that students with EBD bring to that picture. And there really were no resources out there that really targeted that population. So the second guide, practice guide that got created, this is about how do you increase the career and technical education coursework during transition planning. And this again has a real step-by-step process for educators to think about how to do assessment and career exploration activities, how to develop individual learning plans, how to develop IEP supports and related activities that reinforce CTE learning. And again, this is actually an area where there isn't a lot of step-by-step guidance out there for educators, and we did not find any that had this specific students with EBD focus. And lastly, our third guide was about how do you help educators to partner with community agencies during transition planning, again, specifically for students with EBD. And this practice guide really walks through the importance of community partnerships, about how do you identify the potential partners. And by partners, these can be folks like, this may be a representative from a community college, or this may be a representative from a voc rehab agency in your state. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a 5-year project. The first year was spent really drafting out and developing the practice guides. The second year was spent pilot testing these guides with the Darlington County School District in South Carolina. We are now in year 3 of the project, so that is the bolded third bullet there, where we are actually implementing and providing technical assistance to a set of targeted states to actually use the practice guides. We put out an open call with our partners, I should say, with NTACT, to identify states that we knew had a particular interest among special educators in the student with EBD population. We heard back from a number of states, and through a vetting process decided on 2 states to participate in piloting. So the first is Connecticut, and you'll see that we have a set of schools who will be partnering, who will be implementing the community partners practice guide, and then a second set of schools that will be implementing and helping us to evaluate the student-led guide. And then in Maine, we have a set of 4 schools who will be specifically focusing on the career and technical education guide. So the guides are fully drafted, and where we're at is we are now going out to all those schools that you saw listed to train them in how to use the guides. So we have trainers from NTACT as well as Sloan Huckabee, who's our test project consultant, who is also a special educator herself, are going out for a day and a half of training with educators in Connecticut as well as educators in Maine. And it is not only the educators who will be actually implementing the guides themselves with the students, but we've asked educators to bring with them their implementation team. So our definition of that is fairly broad. Basically, it's anybody who you identify as really being critical to helping you launch and sustain the implementation of the practice in your school. We think this would include educators, so the people who are actually using the guides with the students during the IEP process. It might be administrators or decision makers in your school who can help allot resources to the practice. It may also be school counselors or psychologists who are working with your students with EBD. And finally, it may be other people that we're not aware of, but we really left the decision about who is part of that implementation team up to the schools themselves. And even for the schools that are implementing a particular practice guide for purposes of our evaluation, which I'll explain in a minute, we are training everybody up on all 3 of the practice guides. After the training, the pilot sites will participate in regular calls with the trainers to receive coaching and technical assistance, as well as to have a community of other educators who are using the same practice guide to problem solve, troubleshoot, and help us start collecting feedback on how it's going. During this 3rd and part of the 4th year of our grant, so through 2018 into the beginning of 2019, we will be collecting some evaluation data. I want to point out that this will not be evaluating how the schools, we won't be evaluating if students are doing better through using these, through being exposed to the practice guide. The evaluation is more about the process of how the guides have been implemented to understand how we can, moving forward, best support educators in these states and ultimately in other states to actually use these guides in their school and bring this knowledge into practice. So briefly, our evaluation plan consists of doing a pre-post survey to understand how we're training educators. We'll also be asking educators to complete an implementation and fidelity checklist. We will be having an evaluation of the practice guides themselves, so that is the information in here what you need to use, what are the things that you really like, what are the things that seem less helpful. We'll also be looking at some de-identified IEP records to try to assess whether the goals of the guide, for example, the increasing CTEs, were actually done and documented in the IEP. We will be assessing and evaluating how the coaching and technical assistance sessions are going. And finally, we'll collect some satisfaction survey from other stakeholders in this process. So that will include, but may not be limited to, students who have been partnering in using the practice guides, the parents of those students, and individual community partners. So what do the next few years look like? We are in year 3. We will be training these 10 sites, coaching, technical assistance, evaluating the implementation, and all through this collecting iterative feedback about the practice guides in the process so that we can do another set of revisions to the guides. Moving forward in year 4, we will be continuing to do coaching and technical assistance, etc., but we'll also be developing a implementation guidance and technical assistance toolkit. And the goal is finally in year 5 that the toolkit and the practice guides will be available to states across the U.S. so that any school could implement and use these guides, and they will be available through the NTACT website. So that's a quick summary of where the test project is in year 3 at the midway point. If you would like to learn more about this project, please feel free to email myself, Kate Biebel, or Marcia Ellison, as we are the co-PIs on this project. Also, if you want to learn more about this project or other research and activities that are specifically focused on youth and young adults with mental health conditions, I encourage you to Google us at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. That's the easiest way to find us instead of putting a long URL. We are part of the UMass Medical School. So thanks for your time. We look forward to talking with you in year 4.
Well, thanks very much, Kate, for sharing this update about the test project. It seems like you guys are very busy. Before we close today, I wanted to invite all of you to fill out this brief evaluation form. You can find the link here on the slide, and I'll also email it to everybody who's registered. You may ask your questions about the test project on this evaluation, or feel free to email me at aoutlaw@air.org, and I'll be sure to get those questions to Kate. So again, I'd like to thank all of you for listening to today's webcast, and we appreciate the support of NIDILRR to carry out today's webcast and all of the KTER Center's activities. So thank you. Have a good day.